Okay. Thank you, Chen, for the very kind introduction. This is great honor of mine to be a recipient of Lawrence Brown PhD Student Award. And for today's talk, I'm going to discuss some of our recent work on the statistical inference for high-dimensional GLM with binary outcomes. So most of the results I'm going to present today are mainly done during my PhD study at the University of Pennsylvania under the joint supervision of Professor Tony Kai and Professor Hongzhe Li, and also in collaboration with Professor Zijian Guo from Rutgers University. Okay, so the increasing availability of large and especially high-dimensional data set have been witnessed in many research areas so far, ranging from genetics, biomedical clinical research to finance. And the word high dimensionality highlight or signify the situation where we have the number of features or the size of the parameters, model parameters are much larger than the sample size. And under such high dimensional settings, people have witnessed the limitations of classical statistical theories and method. For example, those methods based on classical maximum likelihood. And things become different because of the key insight that we obtained from the past 30, 40 years of decades in the field of high-dimensional statistics, which is that one need to use structures in the data. And structures can be helpful as a complement to our limitations in the measurement in comparison to the complexity of the problem. So in this talk, I'm going to mainly discuss the high-dimensional binary GLM and its inference problems. So as a general formulation of the problem, we have a data set consisting of n samples independently drawn from the following generative model. So for the outcome, we have a binary outcome yi, which takes values in 0 and 1, and its conditional distribution given a high-dimensional random vector xi, which plays a role as covariate in this regression model, is a Bernoulli distribution, whose expected mean is a function of the linear form, and here the beta is a regression coefficient. And this the design or the covariate vector xi marginally it follows some unknown distribution px. And here by high dimensionality in this context, it means that the dimension of beta or the number of covariate p is much larger than n. And here we will also only consider the case where the structures for the regression vector is a sparsity, which means most of the components in beta are 0. And here we will simultaneously consider a large class of binary GLMs by allowing various choices of the link function f here, which maps the real numbers to something between 0 and 1. And for different examples of f, we recover different special GLM models that we have been considered in other applications. For example, when f is x-bit function, we recover the logistic regression. When f is CDF of standard Gaussian, we have probability regression, which also has many applications. And we will also have a little bit more complicated latent variable model as a special case. So the statistical inference problems for binary GLMs has been extensively considered in the past 1.5 decades. And people have considered problems such as parameter estimation, support recovery, or more challenging problems of constructing confidence intervals of statistical tests, or some more machine learning oriented problems like classification and prediction. And for today's talk, I would like to discuss some of our recent development in these inference problems, which hopefully extended the scope of the current research in the following 2 aspects. First of all, most of the current work, they consider only one special case in that class of binary GLMs, notably logistic regression. And here, by allowing flexibility of the link function, we are giving a unified treatment of a large class of problems in terms of inference on beta. And on the other hand, we also want to have a more in-depth understanding of the problem as a whole, not only not satisfied by proposing a specific method inference procedure, but also we want to understand what is the statistical limit and what are the optimal procedures for a problem. So for a brief outline of this talk, we will first discuss the general method for the inference of individual coefficient in this beta vector and also its consequences on various inference problems. And then we will turn to some more theoretical problems to study to discuss the optimality issues. And finally, we will finish by briefly talking about its applications and its extensions to other related inference problems. So the general method that we proposed for this binary GLMs, it starts with the very well-known penalized log likelihood estimator. And here in this loss function, this LF is the negative of log likelihood, which we want to minimize. And here this index F highlights its dependence on this link function F. And for example, when this F is the X-bit function, this penalized log likelihood estimator, it takes the form of now well understood logistic lasso estimator. And the statistical property of this beta hat has been widely, extensively studied over the past 1 or 2 decades, and people have shown its consistency and rate of convergence so far and so forth. However, for a long time, it is very difficult to push forward to like a confidence intervals or statistical test. It's because it's very difficult to obtain or characterize its distribution. And now we clearly understood that the difficulty actually is fundamental in this estimator because we know that this beta hat estimator fundamentally is biased. It means that even if we are able to precisely characterize its fluctuation, the center of this estimator is still off target, so that it's difficult to directly derive limiting distributions for further inference. And a major breakthrough was made in 2014. And in that year, a few papers came out roughly at the same time, which coined the idea of so-called bias correction. And here I gave a very brief overview of this idea. Basically, one starts by doing a careful analysis of this lasso type estimator beta hat along with its bias. And the second step, by making use of the mathematical insight that we obtained from the first step, we will construct a so-called debiased estimator beta tilde, and which basically correct for the bias in this lasso estimator by this debiased term, delta J. And hopefully this beta tilde will have much more reduced bias than this original estimator. And in particular, we will also be able to obtain a symptotic normality once the remaining bias is keeping small, and inference procedures can be developed accordingly, just as what we have done in the classical statistics. And here, without bothering you with mathematical details from the first step, that penalized logistic lasso estimator, here I directly gave the general form of the debiased estimator for the generalized for that binary GLM. And I do want to point out that there is a similarity in the debiased term to that in the linear high-dimensional linear regression as studied in that 3 papers. The key difference is that here in this general form, we allow a further flexibility by considering sample-specific weights, WI, which essentially characterize the differences in the contribution of different samples to the final bias in this beta hat estimator. And another parameter need to be determined is this U vector, which is usually called the projection vector. Basically, we want to choose this U and W so that the final beta tilde satisfies some satisfactory property. And here I gave you an overview, a brief discussion of how we choose these two parameters. We start by considering error decomposition of this device estimator, which can be directly obtained by using the formula here, equation 5, and also the binary GLM itself. And we will recognize that in terms of decomposition, the first term is asymptotic normal term, which mainly contributes to the variability in the device estimator. And then we also have some remaining bias whose magnitude is driven by the quality of the initial lasso estimator, as well as our choice of W and U. And the idea of choosing W and U are based on the bias variance trade-off. So ideally, we want both the remaining bias and the asymptotic variance to remain small. But usually there is a trade-off, and it turns out that the best way to keep a balance between these two parts is by equalizing the red term in the remaining bias and the blue term in the asymptotic variance. And by solving this equation, we have the final form of a perfect choice of Wi. And we use plug-in estimator for this beta in the denominator, and we have the final form, which is a simple function of this linear form x transpose beta hat, and the function is a function only depend on the pre-specified link function, so that for different link function, we will have a version of sample-specific weights. And similarly, we can use the same idea to choose that projection vector u, and we will consider solving this constraint optimization, where we minimize the asymptotic variance colored in blue, in the same time controlling the remaining bias colored in red. And this form is this form comes from by applying a Holder's inequality to the remaining bias. And we know that this L1 norm of the lasso estimator can be well controlled, so that it just will be sufficient to control the remaining bias, the red form. And by plugging in this U hat and W hat, we have the final closed form representation of the device estimator, which can be computed relatively efficient given the data. And once we obtain the device estimator, it will be relatively easy to show that it is asymptotic normal for each individual regression coefficient. And also we can construct inference procedures like confidence intervals and various statistical tests accordingly, which I will not go into detail. So far, we obtained a way to derive inference procedures for a large class of link functions. However, we are not satisfied with what we obtained so far. We want to theoretically evaluate its performance in comparison with existing method. Although the existing method, we may only consider, say, logistic regression, but we still want to know that how our method works compared to those previous methods. And that need to be understood through the perspective of decision theory. And here we mainly focus on the confidence interval construction. And here to make our discussion more rigorous, we will mathematically define what is an optimal confidence interval. And we will define the confidence interval through its optimality through its expected length. So the shortest expected length that confidence have among all the 1 minus alpha confidence interval will be considered optimal. So in abstract, one can imagine there is a large class of level 1 minus alpha confidence intervals, which include our proposal as well as many other existing methods. And our first result in this part is that we show that when this sparsity is not too large, when it is small than this square root n over log p, then the expected length of our proposed estimator is of the same order as the shortest possible expected length among all the 1 minus alpha confidence intervals. And this gives optimality of our proposal when beta is so-called ultra sparse. And the next step, next question that we would ask is that what happens beyond this ultra sparse regime? Does other methods perform better than us in that regime. And it turns out that the problem is more complicated than we thought. And we need to draw idea from adaptivity. An adaptive confidence interval here means that that confidence interval is simultaneously optimal for various choices of sparsity, because in reality, sparsity is always unknown to us. We want to ask a confidence interval that is optimal regardless what sparsity the model is. And from our previous discussion, we know that, of course, our proposed estimator is adaptive over that ultra-sparse regime. However, what happens beyond the ultra-sparse regime? And this leads to our second result in this part. We show that to our surprise that beyond the ultra-sparse regime, adaptive confidence interval actually does not exist. So it means that it's not simply the limitation of our proposal. It is fundamentally rooted in the difficulty of the problem in the less sparse case. Simply impossible to construct a confidence interval that is simultaneously optimal for a sparsity K1 and another sparsity K2 that are both larger than this quantity. So as a diagram summarizing what I've been discussing by considering all the possible ranges values of this sparsity, when this sparsity lies in the ultra sparse regime colored in green, then adaptive confidence intervals is possible, and it is apparently our method achieved that possibility. And beyond ultra sparse regime, simply adaptive confidence interval is impossible. The problem is simply too hard for us to do anything. And another advantage of our proposal is its flexibility in terms of problem setup. So we realized that most of the method requires a so-called balanced case control probability condition, meaning that for each individual sample in that data set, the conditional probability of being case and being control, the product need to be strictly bounded away from zero. It means that all the samples need to somehow be ambiguous, cannot be too extreme. We find that our proposal, we actually do not need such a condition, although we allow for much more flexibility of the link function. And unlike most of the problems where you can imagine that removing one or two technical conditions may not lead to significant advantage in practice, the behavior will just remain the same. But here in our case, we find that our proposal, by removing this condition, we also see empirical advantage than other method. So to demonstrate this, we compared our proposed confidence interval to 3 existing methods. Sorry, this should be our project. And we consider 2 settings. We will consider 95 confidence intervals for a single regression coefficient beta j. And the first setting is that a significant amount of samples has the product of their probabilities being very close to 0. So that balanced case control probability condition is violated. And in the second case, that condition is satisfied. The product are bounded away from 0 for most of the cases. And we did observe that 2 of the existing methods, they break down in light of violation of the assumption. And for the 2 methods that achieve the desirable coverage, our method has shorter lengths in the confidence interval. And when the condition is satisfied, all the 4 methods seems to be performing well, although our proposal still gives relatively shorter confidence intervals on average. And finally, I want to briefly discuss some extensions and applications of the method we have been discussing so far. The main point is that although we are only talking about inference about individual regression coefficient in a regression model, it turns out that the idea and the general methodology can be extended to other inference problems as long as they are related to binary GLM. And here we will focus on one case, one application from genetics. So in genetics, people are interested in studying the so-called genetic relatedness between two diseases or two phenotypes. And this problem can be well formulated by considering two logistic regression models. So here, suppose we have a pair of binary traits, W and Y, and they are both associated with a high dimensional genetic variance, but in different ways. Okay, so in this, we can model it through two logistic regressions, so that between X and Y, we have model 1, whose coefficients are beta, intercept alpha, and between W and X, we have another logistic regression model. And the genetic relatedness can be quantified by the following two quantities based on this double logistic regression model. The first one is we define as genetic covariance, which is the covariance between the log of odds ratio between the two outcomes Y and W through the same covariate X. And as you can imagine, if this covariance is large, then it means there are much more sharing in the that association mechanism between Y and W. And that we will interpret as that they have more similarity in the fundamental genetic architecture. And by working with this logistic regression model, we can derive that this quantity turns out to be a bilinear form that only functional only depending on the beta, gamma 2 regression coefficients and the population covariance matrix of the covariance, the X vector. And similarly, we can also define the genetic correlation, which is a normalized version of the above quantity. And in the end, we also have a normalized functional. And although it seems that in the previous case, we only consider individual regression coefficient, but it turns out that idea can be also useful here for making inference of these functional parameters. And again, we can consider start with logistic lasso estimator for beta and gamma, and also a sample covariance matrix estimate. And we start by considering error decomposition of simple plugin estimator. And we can recognize that there are leading bias and some higher order bias, and also asymptotic normal term. And our goal is, again, to design a bias corrected estimator where we remove the leading bias from this simple plugin estimator, so that what remains will be only that asymptotic normal term and some higher order bias. And it turns out that we're able to obtain a de-biased estimator, which are provably optimal. And it also has some confidence intervals and statistical tests that follows subsequently. And here, although without much detail of what we have done, the main idea is to point out that the general proposal in the previous part of the talk is useful and has potentiality for other inference problems in terms of constructing the de-biased estimator, and usually it will lead to optimal procedures. And here, again, due to the time limit, I'm not able to show some real applications of the method in the case study, but in this paper, we did include an interesting case study where we analyzed the statistical, the genetic relatedness between 10 pairs of autoimmune diseases. And as a quick summary of this talk, we basically considered inference for beta under a large class of binary GLMs by allowing flexibility of link function, and we discussed a unified approach, which is followed by some discussions of statistical limit, optimality, and adaptivity, mainly for confidence intervals. And then we also show that there are further advantages from this unified approach, and also the extensions to other inference problems. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank again my PhD advisors, Hongzhe Li and Tony Kai, for their exceptional mentorship And also I'm grateful to my PhD program, GGEB at University of Pennsylvania. And of course, I also want to thank IMS for giving me this award and this opportunity to present in the annual meeting. I'm very sorry that due to my visa issue, I'm not able to be in there, join you in person, but I was very eager to. And as a proof of my eagerness, last week I was in Florida attending a conference during which I spent a day in Orlando in the Universal Studio. And just as I was walking around the park, suddenly a grand train station came to my view, which says there is a train goes to London King's Cross. And I directly walked in without any hesitation. And apparently the fact that I'm still giving talk remotely means that they failed to make it, but I hope the 2 hours that I spent waiting in line for the Hogwarts Express is a proof of my eagerness to be there in London. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron, for a very engaging talk. We have some time for questions. Any question from the audience or from King Cross? Okay, let me start with one question. So you mentioned that the confidence interval that you constructed is optimal out to some constant, I think. Is there anything that you can say about the pre-constant? Because I think for confidence, the pre-constant matters a lot. So.
Yeah, this is a great question. I actually, because of the time, I intentionally omitted some details. So we both constructed show that the rate is optimal. And also for all the root as confidence intervals, we show that for a large class of link function, actually our proposed confidence interval attend the Cramer-Rao lower bound, meaning that the constants are also optimal, which include like logistic regression, probability regression, and so on. Yeah. So efficiency is also achieved by the debiasing.
Great. Any other question from the audience? All right. Okay. If not, let's thanks Rong again.
Thank you.
Okay. So, the next speaker.